Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today, we bring you a new story. The complete story of Job explained. Why would God allow this? Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. The content of this video has been compiled from various sources, so if there are any omissions or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story. Some stories in the Bible inspire hope. Some offer wisdom. But the story of Job does something far more unsettling. It asks a question most believers would rather avoid. What if suffering is not punishment? What if pain arrives without explanation? What if faith is tested not when life is good, but when everything you love is ripped away in a single moment? Job was not introduced as a wicked man. Quite the opposite. Scripture describes him as blameless, upright, deeply devoted to God. And yet he became the center of one of the most disturbing trials in all biblical history. His wealth vanished, his children died, his body collapsed into agony, his friends accused him, heaven seemed silent. And the deeper this story goes, the more dangerous its questions become. Because the book of Job is not really about one ancient man. It is about every person who has ever looked at suffering and asked, why? But what if the answer is far more complex than we have been told? What if the real story of Job changes the way we understand pain, justice, faith, and even God himself? Before the suffering, before the ashes, before the agonizing questions that would echo through centuries of theology, philosophy, and human grief, the story of Job begins in a way that feels almost deceptively peaceful. The biblical text introduces us not to a broken man, but to a remarkably successful one. In the land of Uz, there lived a man named Job. And immediately the language of the text makes something unmistakably clear. This is not a villain about to receive punishment. This is not a secret hypocrite waiting to be exposed. This is not a cautionary tale about hidden corruption. Instead, Job is described with words that carry extraordinary moral weight. He is blameless. He is upright. He fears God. He turns away from evil. That introduction matters, because everything that follows depends on understanding this point correctly. In modern ears, the word blameless can sound like perfection, as though Job never sinned, never struggled, never failed in any moral sense. But in the Hebrew world of the text, that is not what the term necessarily means. It points more toward integrity, wholeness, moral sincerity, a life genuinely oriented toward righteousness rather than deceit. Job is being presented as a man of authentic devotion, someone whose public life and private character align. And this framing destroys one of the easiest explanations before the story even begins. His suffering cannot be casually dismissed as obvious divine punishment. But Job was not only morally respected, he was astonishingly prosperous. The text paints a portrait of immense wealth measured in the economic language of the ancient Near East. Thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys, servants in large numbers. A household so substantial that Job is described as the greatest man among all the people of the East. That phrase is not decorative exaggeration. It signals status, influence, social importance, and, likely, political significance. In the ancient world, wealth was not merely about comfort. It was survival, prestige, power, generational security, and visible evidence of social standing. A man like Job would have been seen not simply as successful, but as blessed. And that word blessed carries theological implications. In much of ancient religious thought, prosperity was often interpreted as evidence of divine favor. The righteous prospered, the wicked eventually fell. Moral order and material reality were expected to align. This assumption was not unique to Israelite thought. Similar patterns appear across the wider ancient Near Eastern world. Divine justice was often imagined as visible, immediate, and measurable. If your life was flourishing, perhaps heaven smiled on you. If disaster struck, perhaps something had gone terribly wrong. That worldview matters because the book of Job is about to dismantle it piece by piece. Yet before that demolition begins, the story wants us to fully inhabit the world where such assumptions feel natural. Job also appears as a devoted family patriarch. He has 7 sons and 3 daughters, a number pattern that many readers notice for its symbolic resonance, suggesting completeness or fullness. His children feast together, apparently maintaining close family relationships, rotating celebrations among their households. And Job, acting with almost priestly concern, regularly offers sacrifices on their behalf, fearing that perhaps they may have sinned inwardly, perhaps even cursed God in their hearts. Notice the psychology here. Job is not indifferent. He is deeply spiritually attentive. He worries about unseen moral realities. He takes religious responsibility seriously. He does not merely perform ritual for appearance. He seems genuinely concerned with holiness, both his own and his family's. This further reinforces the central narrative claim. Job is not careless. He is not rebellious. He is not spiritually asleep. In many ways, he represents precisely the kind of person ancient readers might expect God to protect. But this raises an uncomfortable question. What exactly is the book of Job trying to do? Because if the text began by introducing a corrupt tyrant or an obvious sinner, the story would be simple. Disaster would fit expectation. Moral logic would remain intact. Instead, the author deliberately constructs the most difficult possible case. A good man, a faithful man, a prosperous man, a respected man, a spiritually serious man, then asks what happens when suffering enters that life. The geographical setting adds further intrigue. Job lives in the land of Uz, a place whose precise location remains debated among scholars. Some connect it to regions east or southeast of Israel, possibly near Edom or northern Arabia. Others see the ambiguity itself as meaningful. Job may be intentionally situated outside familiar covenant geography. He is not explicitly identified as an Israelite. There is no mention of Moses, Sinai, Jerusalem, kingship, or temple institutions. This gives the story a universal quality. Job is not framed narrowly within Israel's national history. He stands more broadly as a human figure confronting divine mystery. That matters enormously for interpretation. The book of Job is not merely about one ethnic community's covenant struggle. It addresses questions that transcend borders, traditions, and historical moments. Why do the righteous suffer? Is suffering always deserved? Can faith survive unexplained pain? What does justice look like when life appears profoundly unjust? Literary scholars have long noted the extraordinary sophistication of Job's construction. Even the opening feels carefully engineered. The calm is intentional. The abundance is intentional. The moral clarity is intentional. Everything is arranged so that the coming disruption feels not merely tragic, but philosophically explosive. Because once suffering enters this world, it will not simply wound Job. It will wound assumptions about reality itself. And perhaps that is why this ancient text continues to feel disturbingly modern. Even now, many people still carry versions of the same hidden equations. Good choices should produce good outcomes. Faithfulness should create protection. Moral effort should result in stability. Bad things should happen for understandable reasons. When those assumptions collapse, suffering becomes more than pain. It becomes existential disorientation. Job's world, before the storm, is a world many humans instinctively believe should exist. A morally ordered universe where righteousness and blessing visibly align. The brilliance of the narrative is that it establishes that world convincingly before tearing it apart. Because the deepest challenge of Job is not simply enduring pain. It is confronting what happens when your understanding of how reality works begins to fail. And at this point in the story, Job has absolutely no idea that everything he believes about stability, justice, blessing, and suffering is about to be tested in ways no human being could ever imagine. If Chapter 1 established the world as Job understood it, Chapter 2 shatters the illusion that human beings ever see the full story. Because while Job lives in prosperity on earth, completely unaware of any approaching catastrophe, the narrative suddenly cuts to a scene no human witness could possibly observe. The setting shifts from the land of Uz to the heavenly court, and with that shift, the book of Job becomes something far more unsettling. The suffering that is about to unfold is not triggered by hidden sin, political conspiracy, or random natural misfortune, at least not at the narrative level presented by the text. Instead, the story opens a window into a cosmic conversation. And what makes this scene so disturbing is not merely what happens, but what it suggests about the hidden dimensions of reality. The text describes the sons of God presenting themselves before the Lord, language that evokes a divine council setting, familiar in ancient Near Eastern and Hebrew literary imagery. This is not necessarily a literal architectural courtroom as modern imagination might picture it, but a symbolic presentation of heavenly governance, cosmic administration, and divine oversight. Among these beings appears a figure identified in Hebrew as Ha-Satan. This detail is crucial because many modern readers immediately import later Christian assumptions about Satan as the fully developed embodiment of cosmic evil, the devil as popularly imagined. But the Hebrew text here is more nuanced. Ha-Satan literally means the accuser or the adversary, functioning more like a title than necessarily a personal proper name. In this early textual context, the figure appears less as an independent rebel waging war against God, and more as a prosecutorial presence within the divine council framework. Someone who challenges claims, tests assumptions, and questions appearances. That does not make the figure harmless, but it does complicate simplistic readings. The accuser has been roaming throughout the earth, observing humanity. Then comes one of the most unsettling moments in biblical literature. God himself draws attention to Job. "Have you considered my servant Job?" The language is deeply intentional. Job is described again with emphatic moral affirmation, blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. The narrative removes any ambiguity. This is not mistaken identity. The divine assessment is positive and explicit. But the accuser immediately challenges the sincerity of Job's righteousness. And here, the central question of the entire book finally emerges into the open. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, is Job's faith authentic or merely transactional? Is devotion real when it is surrounded by blessing? Or is faith simply a sophisticated response to reward? The accuser argues that Job's righteousness is economically rational. Of course, Job serves God. He has wealth, health, family, protection, prosperity, status. Remove the blessings, and the loyalty will collapse. This accusation is not merely against Job. It is an accusation against humanity itself. It suggests that religious devotion may be fundamentally self-interested, that apparent faithfulness might simply be spiritual consumerism. Love God because life works. Praise God because the system pays dividends. Trust collapses the moment prosperity disappears. This is what makes the heavenly scene so psychologically devastating. The accusation feels disturbingly plausible, and if true, it would mean that human virtue is far less noble than it appears. Then comes the moment that has troubled readers for centuries. God permits the test. Everything Job has is placed within the accuser's reach. with one boundary. Job himself is not yet to be physically harmed.
This raises enormous theological questions.
Why permit the test at all? Why allow suffering for the sake of proving a point? Is Job merely a participant in a cosmic demonstration he never consented to? These are not superficial objections. Serious theologians, philosophers, and readers have wrestled with them for millennia.
Some interpret the scene as dramatic wisdom literature rather than literal historical mechanics, meaning the heavenly dialogue functions as theological framing rather than documentary reporting. Others accept the scene more literally, while emphasizing divine sovereignty beyond human comprehension. Still others focus less on metaphysical logistics and more on the moral question being explored. But regardless of interpretive framework, the emotional force remains the same.
Job does not know any of this. That ignorance is essential. The audience receives information Job lacks, creating profound, dramatic irony. We understand the test, but Job experiences only unexplained devastation. This difference matters because it transforms how the story functions. The book of Job is not really offering suffering as a puzzle humans can solve with hidden information. In fact, Job himself never receives this heavenly explanation. He suffers without access to the framework readers possess. That literary choice is profound. It suggests that the real human experience of suffering often unfolds without explanatory privilege. We ask why, while lacking the broader perspective we desperately want. The divine council imagery also reflects larger biblical patterns where heavenly governance appears in symbolic, narrative forms. Ancient readers would not necessarily approach this scene with the same modern expectations about genre, metaphysical architecture, or literal courtroom procedures. Wisdom literature often uses elevated imagery to dramatize deep theological truths. The question is not merely whether every detail maps onto cosmic mechanics exactly as imagined, but what the narrative is communicating about faith, integrity, divine sovereignty, and human limitation. And what it communicates is deeply uncomfortable. Human beings may not fully understand the forces, purposes, or realities surrounding their suffering. Even more disturbing, righteousness does not automatically exempt someone from profound testing. In fact, within this narrative, Job suffers precisely because he is righteous, not because he is corrupt. That reverses conventional religious expectation entirely. Usually, suffering is explained as consequence. Here, suffering emerges from integrity being questioned. The man chosen for testing is not the wicked, but the exemplary. That inversion is the philosophical earthquake at the heart of Job. And the challenge posed by the accuser remains hauntingly relevant. Is faith authentic only when rewarded? Would devotion survive collapse if health vanished, if wealth disappeared, if family was shattered, if heaven remained silent? Would reverence endure, or would belief reveal itself as conditional loyalty purchased by blessing? These are not ancient questions alone. They are modern questions, deeply human questions, perhaps even frighteningly personal ones. Because the heavenly court scene does not simply set the plot in motion, it exposes the terrifying possibility that faith may be tested precisely where it claims to be strongest. And somewhere in the land of Uz, entirely unaware that his life has become the center of a cosmic challenge, Job continues living what feels like an ordinary day, not knowing that everything is about to change forever. If the previous chapter revealed a hidden cosmic challenge beyond Job's awareness, this chapter forces us into the brutal human reality of what that challenge actually looks like on the ground. Because theology can feel abstract until suffering arrives in real time. And in the book of Job, suffering does not arrive gradually. There is no slow warning, no emotional preparation, no manageable decline, no gentle unraveling. It comes with terrifying speed. The literary construction is deliberate, almost cinematic in its cruelty.
Messenger after messenger arrives before the previous report can even be emotionally processed. The effect is psychological suffocation. The audience is meant to feel the collapse as Job feels it, wave after wave, without room to breathe. The first blow strikes at economic security. A messenger arrives with catastrophic news. The Sabaeans have attacked. The oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding nearby. Servants have been slaughtered, and only one survivor remains to deliver the report. In the ancient world, this is not merely a financial setback. Wealth was not digital numbers on a screen. It was operational survival. Livestock represented productive capacity, trade value, transportation, labor infrastructure, and generational security. A violent raid meant more than lost assets. It meant destabilization of social identity, household continuity, and practical survival. But before Job can even absorb this, a second messenger arrives. Fire from heaven has fallen, consuming the sheep and servants. Again, only one survives to tell the story. Notice how the narrative escalates uncertainty. The first disaster can be explained through human violence. The second carries a terrifying theological implication. Fire from heaven. Whether the text intends literal supernatural fire, catastrophic lightning, or perceived divine judgment language, the emotional effect is unmistakable. Now the disaster no longer looks merely criminal. It begins to resemble cosmic hostility. And before comprehension can form, a third messenger arrives. The Chaldeans have mounted a coordinated raid, seizing the camels, killing servants, leaving only one witness alive. At this point, the destruction is not isolated. It is systemic. The infrastructure of Job's entire economic world is collapsing in rapid succession. Different attackers, different forms of devastation, no pattern he can easily understand, no strategic response available, no time to recover. But even now, terrible as this is, the deepest wound has not yet come. Then the fourth messenger arrives. And this is where the story crosses from catastrophic loss into unspeakable human grief. Job's sons and daughters were gathered together, feasting in the eldest brother's house, a familiar image recalling the family celebrations introduced earlier. Then a great wind struck the house from the wilderness. The structure collapsed. All the children are dead. Only one survives to deliver the message. That detail matters. The repetition of the lone survivor creates relentless narrative rhythm. But psychologically, it also intensifies isolation. Every messenger is a fragment of a destroyed world. Every report confirms irreversible collapse. And now the center of Job's emotional universe has been obliterated. 10 children. Gone. Modern readers sometimes move too quickly past the scale of this loss because the narrative compresses it into brief prose. But human reality demands we slow down. This is not symbolic inconvenience. This is parental devastation beyond language. The death of one child can permanently fracture a person's psychological world. The loss of all 10 in a single event is almost incomprehensible. Whatever theological questions the book of Job explores, it never asks us to trivialize suffering. The pain is real, the horror is real, the grief is real, and the structure of the chapter matters profoundly. The losses escalate from property to servants, to signs of cosmic disturbance, to family annihilation. The narrative carefully dismantles every layer of human security, economic stability, social standing, household continuity, emotional attachment, future legacy, meaning itself. What makes this especially disturbing is that Job does not possess the information the audience has. We know about the heavenly challenge. Job does not. From his perspective, reality has become chaotic, incomprehensible, perhaps even hostile.
And this is where the psychological realism of the book of Job becomes extraordinary, because most human suffering feels exactly like that. We rarely receive explanatory narration. We do not get heavenly transcripts. We experience collapse without context. That emotional truth gives Job enduring power. Then comes one of the most famous responses in all biblical literature. Job rises. He tears his robe. He shaves his head. These are ancient embodied signs of mourning, grief made visible through culturally recognizable acts of lament. This is not emotional suppression, not denial, not stoic indifference. Job is devastated. The text allows grief its full human legitimacy. Then comes the moment that has echoed across centuries. He falls to the ground in worship and says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." This response is often quoted, but sometimes misunderstood. It should not be read as emotional numbness or simplistic acceptance. Job has not become detached from love. He is grieving profoundly. The significance lies in the fact that his grief has not yet turned into rejection. His worldview is shattered, but his orientation toward God remains intact, at least for now. Theologically, this moment is explosive. Remember the accusation from the heavenly court. Does Job fear God for nothing? Remove the blessings and loyalty will collapse. At this stage, Job does not curse God. The accuser's thesis appears, at least initially, challenged. But the emotional complexity here deserves honesty. Job attributes the losses within divine sovereignty. Yet he does so without access to explanatory details. He is interpreting suffering through the only theological categories available to him. Readers across traditions have debated what exactly this means. Is Job speaking profound trust, primitive assumption, incomplete theology, genuine surrender? The text does not flatten the moment into simplistic doctrinal formula. Instead, it presents a deeply human response under unbearable pressure. Then comes the narrator's chilling summary. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. That statement is important, but it should not be misused. It does not mean Job will never question, never lament, never struggle. Those chapters are still coming. It means that at this specific stage, amid immediate catastrophe, he has not crossed into direct accusation or renunciation. But something critical has changed forever. The prosperous moral universe of Chapter 1 is gone. The cosmic question introduced in Chapter 2 has entered flesh and blood reality. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: Job has passed the first test, but the story is only getting started. Because surviving initial shock is not the same as enduring prolonged suffering. Faith in the first hours of catastrophe is one thing. Faith after pain settles into the body, after silence stretches, after explanations fail, after grief becomes permanent, that is something far more difficult. And Job is about to discover just how much deeper suffering can go. If the previous chapter was about the destruction of Job's world, this chapter is about the destruction of Job himself, because there is a brutal difference between losing what surrounds you and becoming the site of suffering in your own body. Property can be mourned, status can collapse. Even devastating grief, as unimaginable as it is, still leaves the sufferer physically present to endure it. But when pain enters the body, suffering changes character. It becomes intimate, inescapable, constant. The body is where human beings live every waking moment. And when the body becomes hostile territory, suffering stops being an event and becomes an environment. The book of Job understands this with terrifying precision. The narrative returns once again to the heavenly court.
the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and once again the accuser appears among them. The structure intentionally mirrors the earlier scene, but now the stakes are different. God again points to Job's integrity, emphasizing that despite catastrophic losses, Job still holds fast to his righteousness. This detail matters enormously. The text explicitly reinforces that Job's initial suffering was not proof of moral failure. In fact, Job has remained faithful under extraordinary pressure. But the accuser is not satisfied. The first test, he argues, proved nothing. Human beings will protect what matters most. Skin for skin, he says. A person will give everything he has to save his own life. The implication is ruthless. Job's faithfulness survived because the suffering remained external. Take away his health, strike his flesh, bring pain directly into his body. Then the truth will emerge. Then he will curse God to his face. Once again, permission is granted, with a boundary. Job's life itself is spared, but his physical well-being is not. And here, the story enters one of its darkest phases. Job is afflicted with painful sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The description is deliberately comprehensive. This is not localized discomfort. This is total bodily assault. The exact medical nature of Job's condition has been debated for centuries. Scholars and physicians have proposed severe skin diseases, ulcerative infections, inflammatory disorders, systemic illness, even symbolic literary descriptions meant to convey overwhelming suffering rather than precise diagnosis. Some note later references in the text to itching, disfigurement, foul breath, sleeplessness, fever, deteriorating skin, pain in the bones, emotional exhaustion, and social repulsion. Whatever modern label one attempts to impose, the narrative intent is unmistakable. Job is physically broken in a way that is visibly horrifying and psychologically devastating. Then comes one of the most haunting images in the entire book. Job sits among ashes, scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery. It is an image of radical collapse. This is the man once described as the greatest in the East, a figure of wealth, dignity, social stature, religious respectability. Now he sits in the ash heap, physically mutilated, isolated, reduced to managing unbearable pain with shattered ceramic. The symbolism is devastating. Ashes evoke mourning, ruin, mortality, humiliation. Job's external world has not merely collapsed, his social identity has disintegrated. Ancient societies often viewed visible disease not only as physical suffering, but as social stigma. Illness could isolate a person from communal life, mark them as cursed, or provoke fear and disgust. The psychological violence of that reality cannot be overstated. And then the story introduces one of its most controversial figures, Job's wife. Her words are brief, but unforgettable. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Across history, she has often been unfairly reduced to a simplistic villain, but that interpretation deserves caution. Consider her reality. She has lost the same children Job lost. She has witnessed the destruction of their household. She now watches her husband physically disintegrate in agony. Her words may express despair rather than malice, trauma rather than wickedness, emotional collapse rather than theological rebellion alone. This does not mean her counsel is endorsed by the text, but reducing her to caricature misses the human complexity of grief. Sometimes, suffering shatters not only faith, but language itself. Job responds sharply, saying she speaks as one of the foolish women would speak. Yet even here, nuance matters. He asks whether they shall accept good from God and not adversity. Again, the narrator emphasizes that Job does not sin with his lips. But we must read this carefully. This is not the end of Job's emotional journey. The silence, rage, lament, and theological confrontation are still ahead. At this stage, Job remains resistant to outright rejection. but the pressure is mounting, and psychologically this makes perfect sense. Acute trauma often produces shock resilience before longer emotional collapse sets in. Immediate survival is not the same as sustainable endurance. Theologically, the second blow deepens the book's central crisis. If suffering in Chapter 3 attacked Job's world, Chapter 4 attacks the self that must interpret that suffering. Bodily pain has unique power to destabilize meaning. Chronic agony alters thought patterns, emotional regulation, sleep, social relationships, hope, even spiritual perception. Modern psychology and medicine recognize what ancient literature already understood. Physical suffering changes consciousness. A person in relentless pain does not think, feel, or process reality the same way. That matters profoundly for reading what comes next in Job's speeches. His future questions do not emerge from comfortable abstraction. They emerge from embodied agony. The second blow also intensifies the accuser's argument. The issue is no longer merely whether Job values blessings. The question now becomes whether faith can survive when suffering penetrates identity itself. Can a human being continue reverence when the body becomes a prison? When humiliation replaces dignity? When physical pain strips away emotional stability? The Book of Job does not ask shallow questions. It goes directly to the deepest vulnerabilities of human existence. And perhaps this is why the story remains so disturbing. Many people can imagine surviving financial loss more easily than chronic illness. Many can conceptualize external hardship more readily than bodily torment. Because when pain becomes internal, escape becomes impossible. There is no stepping away from your own nervous system, no vacation from your own flesh. Job's suffering is no longer episodic tragedy. It is now continuous habitation inside affliction, and the silence from heaven remains. No explanation, no reassurance, no divine comfort speech, only pain. This silence matters, because unanswered suffering is psychologically different from explained suffering. Meaning changes endurance. Context changes pain. Job has neither, which means the real crisis is only beginning. The man who worshipped in Chapter 3 is still present, but now he sits in ashes, bleeding, exhausted, disfigured, and increasingly surrounded not by clarity, but by unanswered anguish. And very soon, the emotional pressure that has so far remained contained is about to erupt into some of the most raw and honest language ever preserved in sacred literature. By this point in the story, Job has lost his wealth, his children, his health, and any recognizable sense of stability. But one of the most revealing truths about suffering is that devastation rarely remains a solitary internal experience for long. Eventually, other people arrive. Friends, family, advisors, religious voices, well-meaning observers. And often, what happens next can either deepen healing or intensify the wound. The Book of Job understands this with remarkable psychological sophistication because Chapter 5 introduces three men who initially appear as exactly what Job needs: compassionate companions entering the wreckage of unbearable suffering. Yet these same men will eventually become some of the most frustrating and theologically dangerous figures in the entire narrative. Their story begins not with cruelty, but with something profoundly human. The text names them specifically: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. These are not anonymous background characters. Naming matters in biblical storytelling. It grants presence, weight, and relational significance. These men are not random strangers wandering into tragedy. They are Job's recognized companions, men with enough social connection and concern to travel significant distance after hearing about his suffering. That detail matters. Whatever criticism comes later, the story does not begin by portraying them as indifferent. They came because they heard. They responded because they cared. At least, initially. In a world without instant communication, organized transport, or modern infrastructure, such a journey represented intentional effort. They made plans. They traveled. They arrived together. The text explicitly states their purpose, to show sympathy and comfort him. That stated intention is important, because it reminds us that harmful counsel does not always begin with malicious motives. Some of the most damaging responses to suffering come from people who genuinely believe they are helping. Then comes one of the most visually devastating moments in the book. From a distance, they do not even recognize him. Think about what that means. This is not simply a poetic exaggeration. Job's physical deterioration is so extreme, his outward condition so altered, that close companions fail to identify him at first sight. The prosperous patriarch from earlier chapters has become nearly unrecognizable. The emotional force of that detail is enormous. Illness has not merely caused pain. It has transformed appearance, social identity, and human familiarity itself. When they finally recognize the reality of what stands before them, they react with traditional gestures of grief. They raise their voices and weep. They tear their robes. They throw dust upon their heads toward heaven. These are embodied acts of mourning within the ancient world, visible signs that they understand the seriousness of what has happened. This is not superficial sympathy. Their grief appears genuine. And then comes perhaps the single most remarkable thing they do in the entire story. They sit with Job on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one speaks a word, because they see that his suffering is very great. This silence deserves serious attention, because many readers rush past it on the way to the arguments that follow. But in many ways, this may be the most compassionate act these friends ever perform. 7 days of silent presence, no explanations, no theological corrections, no advice, no attempts to force meaning, just shared proximity to pain. In modern terms, this is astonishing emotional intelligence. Sometimes the deepest form of compassion is not explanation, but presence. Not solving, but witnessing. Not speaking, but staying. Ancient mourning practices often involved extended communal lament, and 7 days carried symbolic resonance as a complete mourning period. Yet beyond ritual significance, the emotional reality remains powerful. They saw suffering so severe that words felt inappropriate. And for once, they were right. Because one of the cruelest instincts humans often have in the face of suffering is the compulsion to explain it immediately. Silence feels uncomfortable. Ambiguity feels threatening. Pain without explanation creates anxiety, not only for the sufferer, but for observers. People want answers because unanswered suffering destabilizes everyone. But these 7 days represent a rare suspension of that impulse. They simply remain present. And in doing so, they offer something profoundly humane. Yet even within this moving moment, tension quietly builds. Silence can be healing, but it can also be fragile. Shared grief can create solidarity, but it does not guarantee shared understanding. The audience already knows something Job's friends do not. We know the heavenly framework. They do not. More importantly, unlike the audience, they will interpret suffering through conventional theological assumptions that seem perfectly reasonable within their worldview. This is where the tragedy deepens. Because these are not cartoon villains preparing to attack Job out of spite. They are representatives of a very recognizable kind of human certainty. People who believe suffering must make moral sense. People who assume pain can be explained if one reasons correctly. People who cannot tolerate unresolved ambiguity. And initially, their silence delays that problem, but only temporarily. Psychologically, the 7-day silence also accomplishes something crucial for the narrative. It allows pressure to accumulate. Job sits in agony, physically shattered, emotionally devastated, surrounded by silent witnesses. No explanation comes, no relief arrives. Heaven remains silent. Human companionship exists, but without interpretation. This creates a kind of emotional vacuum, and vacuums do not remain empty forever. Eventually, someone will speak. And when speech begins, everything changes. Theologically, this chapter marks a subtle but important transition. Until now, Job's conflict has primarily been vertical, between human suffering and divine silence. But soon, the conflict becomes horizontal as well, between competing human interpretations of suffering. That shift matters because much real-world suffering unfolds the same way. Pain is difficult enough, but then come the voices attempting to explain it. Sometimes compassion, sometimes judgment, sometimes wisdom, sometimes harmful certainty disguised as wisdom. The book of Job is preparing us for one of the most important debates in biblical literature, and it does so by making the participants emotionally believable. These are not obvious enemies. They begin as mourners. They begin as companions. They begin by doing something deeply right that makes what follows far more tragic. Because failure in friendship is often most painful when it emerges from people we trusted. And perhaps that is why this chapter remains so timeless. Most people who have endured serious suffering understand this pattern instinctively. Some friends arrive beautifully at first. They show up, they sit, they care. But eventually, discomfort with unanswered pain pushes conversation toward explanation, correction, or subtle blame. Presence becomes analysis. Compassion becomes argument. Listening becomes certainty. The silence that once felt holy becomes impossible to maintain. And that is exactly where Job's story is headed. Because the 7 days are ending, the silence is about to break. And once words begin, the emotional and theological battle at the heart of this book will truly begin. For 7 days, Job said nothing. 7 days of physical agony, 7 days of unbearable grief, 7 days sitting in ashes, surrounded by silent companions, beneath a heaven that offered no explanation. And then, finally, the silence breaks. But what emerges is not a calm theological reflection, not a measured sermon on perseverance, not the polished language of triumphant faith. What comes out is something far more raw, far more unsettling, and far more human. Job opens his mouth and curses the day of his birth. This moment is one of the most extraordinary emotional turning points in all of Scripture, because it refuses the simplistic religious assumption that faithful people always suffer with tidy composure. The man who worshipped after catastrophe in earlier chapters has not become faithless, but he has reached a psychological breaking point. And the book of Job allows that reality to exist without censorship. Job does not curse God directly. That distinction matters, especially given the accuser's earlier prediction. But he does something almost equally shocking in ancient theological terms. He curses the day he entered existence. Let the day perish on which I was born. Let the night that said, a man is conceived, become darkness. This is not poetic exaggeration for dramatic flair alone. It is existential protest. Job is not merely saying he wishes things were easier. He is questioning whether existence itself was ever a gift. That level of despair deserves to be taken seriously. Modern readers, especially those shaped by sanitized religious storytelling, can feel unsettled by this chapter because it sounds dangerously close to hopelessness. But the brilliance of the biblical text is that it does not erase the emotional realities of extreme suffering. It preserves them. Job's language is intentionally cosmic in scope. He does not simply wish for personal relief. He imagines the undoing of time itself. Let darkness claim the day of his birth. Let no light shine upon it. Let the calendar forget it ever existed. This is language of reversal, almost anti-creation imagery. In Genesis, creation begins with light, order, distinction, meaning. Job's lament symbolically moves in the opposite direction, back toward darkness, disorder, non-existence. Scholars have long noted how carefully crafted this poetry is. It is not random emotional collapse. It is structured anguish, intelligent despair, theologically literate pain. That distinction matters. Job is not irrational. He is wounded. There is a difference. And perhaps one of the most important truths this chapter teaches is that suffering does not eliminate intelligence. Deep pain often produces some of the most profound existential questions human beings can ask. Why was I born? Why was life given to someone destined for misery? Why does consciousness continue when relief seems impossible? These are not uniquely ancient questions. They are painfully modern. What makes Job's lament even more significant is that it exposes a theological misunderstanding many people carry. There is a difference between despair and apostasy, between lament and unbelief, between crying out in agony and abandoning faith entirely. Some religious cultures mistake emotional honesty for spiritual failure, but the book of Job refuses that equation. The very presence of this chapter in sacred scripture suggests that anguished protest is not automatically disqualifying. In fact, the Bible contains an entire tradition of lament, psalms of complaint, cries of confusion, prophetic anguish. Even later biblical figures wrestling openly with suffering and divine silence. Job belongs within that tradition, though perhaps in its most intense form. He continues by reflecting on death not as terror, but as relief. The grave appears restful. The weary are at ease. Prisoners hear no oppressor. Great and small lie together. This is emotionally devastating language, but it reveals something psychologically recognizable. Severe suffering can radically alter one's perception of what constitutes peace. When life becomes dominated by pain, rest itself becomes precious beyond imagination. The text does not romanticize this. It presents it with sober honesty. And importantly, Job is not philosophizing from abstraction. His body is diseased. His children are dead. His wealth is gone. His social identity has collapsed. This is not melodrama. It is trauma speaking. The silence of the friends intensifies the moment as well. Remember, this speech emerges in communal space. Job is not privately journaling. He is voicing anguish before witnesses. That matters because suffering often becomes even more complex when language finally enters shared space. Once pain is spoken aloud, others feel pressure to respond, interpret, correct, defend their own worldview. And this is precisely why Chapter 6 functions as the ignition point for the book's great debate. Job's lament creates a theological crisis not only because of what he says, but because it forces everyone around him to confront unresolved suffering directly. His words threaten conventional assumptions about how righteous people should behave under affliction. Theologically, this chapter marks a major escalation. Earlier, Job endured loss while maintaining a posture of surrender. Now the emotional cost of suffering becomes fully visible. This progression is psychologically realistic. Acute shock often produces temporary functional resilience, but prolonged suffering without explanation erodes emotional stability over time. Pain accumulates, exhaustion compounds grief, silence becomes intolerable, meaning begins to fracture. The Book of Job understands long before modern psychology that human endurance is dynamic, not static. People do not process catastrophe in neat, linear stages. They break, regroup, question, collapse, speak, rage, and grieve unpredictably. Job's lament is not a contradiction of earlier faith. It is what faith sounds like when passing through unbearable darkness without answers. Some interpreters have tried to soften Job's language, making it more acceptable to tidy theological systems. But doing so misses the point. The power of this chapter lies precisely in its honesty. Scripture does not preserve this speech because it is comfortable. It preserves it because it is true to human experience. There are moments when faithful people do not feel triumphant, moments when existence itself feels unbearable. Moments when prayer sounds less like praise and more like shattered poetry. And the book of Job insists those moments belong within the conversation. Yet there is another crucial observation here. Job still speaks. That may sound obvious, but it matters deeply. Silence can signal resignation. Speech, even anguished speech, implies relationship. Complaint presumes someone hears. Protest assumes meaning remains worth contesting. Job is not withdrawn into nihilistic emptiness. He is still wrestling, still addressing reality, still engaging the moral structure of existence, even as he questions it. In that sense, lament itself may be a strange form of faith. Not certainty, but engagement. Not peace, but refusal to surrender meaning entirely. This is why chapter 6 is so important. It transforms the story from external suffering into explicit theological confrontation. The emotional truth is now fully visible. The respectable silence has ended. The broken man has spoken. And his words are so dangerous, so emotionally honest, so destabilizing to conventional religious assumptions that the people around him will no longer remain silent. Because once suffering asks questions this deep, everyone feels compelled to answer. And that is where the next phase of the story begins. Not with healing, but with argument. Once Job breaks his silence, the atmosphere changes permanently. What had been a scene of shared mourning becomes a courtroom of competing interpretations. The silence that once communicated compassion now gives way to analysis, correction, and theological argument. And to understand why Job's friends respond the way they do, we have to resist the temptation to treat them as simple villains. That would make the story easier, but far less honest. Because the most dangerous theological errors are rarely born from obvious cruelty. They often emerge from systems of thought that appear rational, morally intuitive, and deeply religious. Job's friends are not irrational men. In many ways, they represent one of the most enduring human instincts in the face of suffering, the belief that pain must make moral sense. If something terrible has happened, there must be a reason. If judgment has fallen, someone must deserve it. If the universe is governed by justice, then visible suffering must reflect hidden guilt. This is the intellectual world they inhabit, and, disturbingly, it is a worldview that still survives in many forms today. The first to speak is Eliphaz the Temanite, traditionally portrayed as the most measured and sophisticated of the three. His approach begins gently, almost respectfully. He reminds Job of his former role as one who strengthened others, encouraged the weak, supported those who stumbled. The implication is subtle at first. You have comforted others. Why can you not endure this now? But the argument quickly reveals its core assumption. Who that was innocent ever perished? Where were the upright destroyed? That sentence exposes the foundation of the entire system. For Eliphaz, moral order is visible and reliable. The innocent do not suffer catastrophic destruction. The upright are not ruined. Therefore, if Job is suffering like this, the conclusion seems unavoidable. Something is wrong beneath the surface. Notice the logic. It is internally coherent. If one assumes a universe where divine justice operates in immediately observable ways, then Job's circumstances become evidence. Eliphaz is not merely making accusations out of emotional hostility. He is reasoning from a theological framework that feels self-evident to him. He even appeals to mystical experience, describing a night vision in which a voice asks whether mortal humans can be more righteous than God. This adds spiritual authority to his argument. He is not just offering personal opinion. He believes he is defending divine justice itself. Then comes Bildad, less subtle, more blunt. If Eliphaz reasons carefully, Bildad speaks with harder edges. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? His answer is obvious. Of course not. Therefore, if Job's children died, Bildad suggests, perhaps they sinned. The brutality of that statement is difficult to overstate. Job is grieving 10 dead children, and Bildad introduces moral blame as explanatory theology. Yet again, the logic reflects a rigid framework. God is just. Justice produces appropriate outcomes. Therefore, catastrophic outcomes imply guilt. What makes this especially unsettling is that Bildad believes he is defending moral order. He appeals to tradition, ancestral wisdom, the authority of prior generations. He trusts inherited theological certainty more than the complexity of the suffering before him. Then comes Zophar, often the harshest voice. Where Eliphaz argues and Bildad asserts, Zophar accuses with sharper intensity. He essentially tells Job that if God revealed the full truth, Job would realize he deserves even worse. Repent, he implies, and restoration may follow. At this point, the underlying consensus becomes unmistakable. All three friends differ in tone, but they share the same foundational assumption. Suffering is evidence. Pain reveals moral reality. Catastrophic suffering implies catastrophic sin. This theological system is often called retribution theology, the belief that divine justice reliably rewards righteousness and punishes wickedness in visible historical experience. To be fair, this framework does have biblical roots. Certain wisdom traditions, covenantal themes, and proverbial teachings do emphasize moral cause and effect. Proverbs often presents a world where diligence leads to prosperity, foolishness leads to ruin. Righteousness tends toward life, wickedness toward destruction. The issue is not that the friends invented morality from nowhere. The issue is absolutization. They transform a general wisdom pattern into an inflexible universal law. And once that happens, Job's suffering becomes a theological threat that must be explained away. Historically, this kind of thinking was not unique to ancient Israelite religion. Across the ancient Near East, suffering was frequently interpreted through moral or divine categories. Calamity often implied divine displeasure. Disease could be seen as judgment. Misfortune suggested cosmic imbalance. Humans have long sought moral explanations for suffering, because randomness is psychologically terrifying. A morally ordered universe, even a harsh one, feels more manageable than chaos. If suffering has clear causes, then perhaps it can be avoided. Behave correctly, and disaster stays away. That belief offers emotional control. But Job's existence destabilizes the system. The audience knows what the friends do not. Job is not suffering because of hidden wickedness. Their interpretation is wrong. Yet the brilliance of the book of Job is that their reasoning remains disturbingly recognizable. Even modern people often react similarly. Someone becomes ill, and quiet speculation begins. A business collapses, and people wonder what mistakes were hidden. A tragedy occurs, and observers search for moral causation. Sometimes this appears in religious language, sometimes secular language. But the instinct is similar. We prefer suffering that makes sense. We fear innocent suffering because it threatens our illusion of predictability. Psychologically, the friends may also be defending themselves. If Job can suffer innocently, then they are vulnerable too. But if suffering always reflects guilt, then the world remains ordered. Their theology protects them from existential anxiety. This makes them tragically human rather than merely cruel. Yet the damage they cause is immense, because when theology becomes more important than compassion, suffering people become problems to solve rather than humans to accompany. Their pain becomes evidence in an argument. Their grief becomes a case study. Their honesty becomes insubordination. This is the moral danger at the heart of the Friends' worldview. It can sound deeply religious while becoming profoundly inhumane. The Book of Job does not merely critique bad manners. It challenges a whole interpretive system that weaponizes certainty against suffering. And perhaps the most painful irony is this: the Friends began beautifully in silence. Their worst failure begins when they become convinced they understand what God is doing, theologically. Chapter 7 introduces one of the central tensions of the entire book. Is suffering always morally explanatory? Can visible pain be reliably interpreted as divine judgment? Does justice always operate in immediately observable ways? The Friends answer yes. Job increasingly says no. The audience already knows no. But the emotional power lies in watching these positions collide. Because once suffering becomes a theological argument, compassion becomes harder, certainty becomes louder, and the wounded person is often crushed beneath the explanations of those who believe they are defending truth. And Job, already broken in body and grief, is about to discover that losing health and family is not the only form of suffering. Sometimes one of the deepest wounds comes from being profoundly misunderstood by the people sitting closest to you. By now, the emotional battlefield has shifted dramatically. Job is no longer merely enduring suffering. He is being interpreted by others, judged by theological systems, and pressured to accept explanations that do not match his lived reality. And this is where the book of Job becomes truly explosive. Because Job does not quietly surrender to false certainty. He fights back. What follows is not a neat emotional outburst or a single dramatic speech, but a sustained intellectual and spiritual confrontation unlike anything else in biblical literature. Job challenges his friends, challenges inherited assumptions, challenges the apparent mechanics of justice, and, at moments, comes terrifyingly close to challenging God himself. This is why Chapter 8 represents the philosophical heart of the story. The questions Job raises are dangerous not because they are faithless, but because they refuse simplistic answers. Job begins from a position that creates immediate tension. He does not claim moral perfection in an absolute sense, but he rejects the accusation that his suffering proves hidden wickedness deserving catastrophe. That distinction matters. The Friends want confession because their theology demands causation. Job insists the equation is false. And once he rejects their explanatory system, deeper questions emerge. If suffering is not a reliable indicator of guilt, then what exactly is happening in the world? Is justice functioning the way people assume? Is moral order visible in the predictable way conventional wisdom suggests? These questions destabilize not only his friends, but the very framework many religious people use to understand reality. One of Job's most striking observations is brutally empirical. He looks at life and sees that the wicked do not always collapse quickly. In fact, many appear to thrive. This is one of the most subversive claims in wisdom literature. The neat moral equations preached by his companions do not match observable experience. Corrupt people sometimes prosper. Violent people sometimes grow powerful. The innocent sometimes suffer. The vulnerable are not always protected. If that is true, then the Friends' entire interpretive framework becomes unstable. Job is not making abstract philosophical speculation. He is reasoning from lived reality. The world, as experienced, does not consistently reward virtue and punish vice in immediate, visible ways. This observation remains deeply unsettling because it remains recognizably true. Then Job moves into even more dangerous territory. He wrestles not merely with the existence of suffering, but with divine silence and asymmetry between human fragility and divine power. How can a human being contend with God? Even if innocent, how could one successfully argue before infinite power? This is where Job's thought becomes psychologically and theologically complex. He does not deny God's greatness. In fact, he repeatedly affirms divine power, wisdom, and sovereignty. The problem is precisely that greatness without accessible explanation can feel terrifying. If God is overwhelmingly powerful and suffering remains unexplained, what is the suffering person supposed to do? Job's frustration intensifies around the lack of mediation. He longs for an arbiter, someone who could stand between himself and God, someone capable of bridging the impossible distance between finite human anguish and transcendent divine authority. This longing becomes one of the most emotionally powerful motifs in the book. Job does not merely want answers. He wants relational accessibility. He wants to be heard. He wants justice that feels intelligible. He wants encounter, not abstraction. This matters because Job's deepest struggle is not simple atheistic rejection. It is agonized relational protest. He still takes God seriously enough to demand moral coherence. That is very different from indifference. Some of Job's most shocking language emerges when he describes feeling targeted by God. He speaks as though divine power has turned hostile, as though he has become the object of incomprehensible attack. For some readers, this language feels irreverent, but the book of Job preserves it deliberately. The emotional honesty is the point. Suffering often distorts perception. When pain is relentless and explanation absent, divine silence can feel indistinguishable from abandonment, even aggression. The text allows that emotional reality without immediately correcting every sentence. This is literary honesty of a rare kind. Job also directly confronts the moral discomfort of disproportion. Why would suffering so extreme fall upon someone without corresponding guilt? Why should fragile humans endure overwhelming anguish in a world allegedly governed by justice? The friends keep returning to inherited formulas. Job keeps returning to lived contradiction. This clash between abstract system and empirical suffering drives a narrative with extraordinary force. Theologically, this chapter does something radical. It permits sacred questioning at a depth many religious cultures find uncomfortable. Job asks questions many believers privately fear asking. Why do the wicked prosper? Why does innocence not guarantee protection? Why does God seem silent? Why does justice appear delayed or obscured? Why does suffering often feel morally disproportionate? These are not marginal concerns. They are central human questions. The fact that Scripture includes them so prominently matters enormously. It suggests that authentic faith is not always silent compliance. Sometimes it includes fierce moral wrestling. There is also a literary brilliance in how Job's speeches function. He is not always perfectly consistent. His emotional tone shifts. Hope appears, then collapses. Defiance rises, then despair returns. This inconsistency is not narrative weakness. It is psychological realism. Real suffering rarely produces tidy, coherent philosophy in a straight line. Human beings in anguish oscillate between conviction and confusion, courage and collapse, hope and rage. The book of Job captures that with extraordinary sophistication. Modern readers sometimes expect theological discourse to sound clean and systematic. Job sounds human instead. Another disturbing insight emerges here. The friends believe certainty honors God. Job's questions may actually be more honest than their confidence. This is one of the book's most provocative reversals. Superficial certainty can appear pious while distorting reality. Honest lament can appear dangerous while remaining closer to truth. Job refuses to say what he does not believe simply to preserve theological comfort. That integrity, though messy, matters deeply. Psychologically, Job is also reclaiming agency. Suffering strips control. Accusation strips dignity.
Silence strips meaning. Speech becomes resistance. By articulating protest, Job refuses passive absorption into his friend's narrative. He insists his lived reality matters. That is profoundly human. The chapter also intensifies dramatic irony. The audience knows Job is not suffering because of secret wickedness, yet neither Job nor his friends possess the full picture. This creates layered tension. The friends are wrong, but Job still lacks ultimate explanation. His accurate rejection of false accusations does not yet grant clarity. That complexity makes the book so enduringly powerful. It refuses simplistic hero-villain binaries. Everyone operates with partial knowledge. But some forms of partial knowledge are more damaging than others, and perhaps the most dangerous question of all emerges beneath everything Job says. What if conventional religious explanations for suffering are not only incomplete, but sometimes profoundly unjust? That possibility threatens entire systems of certainty, which is exactly why the conflict escalates so fiercely. Because once Job refuses easy answers, the conversation can no longer remain polite. The stakes are too high. The meaning of justice itself is now under debate. And soon, an unexpected new voice will enter the argument, claiming to see what everyone else has missed. After chapters of emotional collision, theological accusation, and escalating frustration, the book of Job does something unexpected. Just when the audience begins to think the debate has exhausted its possible voices, a new figure steps forward, seemingly from nowhere. His name is Elihu, and his arrival is one of the most debated literary turns in the entire book, because unlike Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, Elihu has not participated in the earlier cycles of argument. He has been silent, listening, observing, waiting. Then suddenly, after the established debate reaches exhaustion, he enters with extended speeches of his own, intense, passionate, and deeply convinced that everyone before him has failed. The moment feels surprising even on first reading. It has led scholars for centuries to ask an uncomfortable question. Was Elihu always meant to be here? Or does his appearance reflect a later editorial insertion into the text? But before we reach those debates, we need to understand what Elihu actually represents inside the story. The text introduces him carefully. He is younger than the others, and this matters culturally. In the ancient world, age carried authority. Younger men were generally expected to defer in serious discourse, especially theological or wisdom debates. Elihu explicitly says this is why he remained silent. He respected age. He assumed wisdom would emerge from older voices. But now, in his view, the elders have failed. They have not answered Job effectively. Job remains unconvinced. The debate has stalled. And Elihu is angry. That emotional tone matters. Unlike the exhausted circularity of the earlier exchanges, Elihu arrives with rhetorical energy, impatience, and confidence. He is angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He is angry with the three friends for failing to refute Job convincingly. This dual frustration defines his role. He sees failure on both sides. That positioning makes him fascinating. He is not simply another repetition of the friends, though there is overlap. Nor is he fully aligned with Job. He presents himself almost as a corrective voice entering where everyone else has gone wrong. His speeches are long, ambitious, and rhetorically intense.
Elihu's core argument differs in important ways from the Friends' strict retribution theology. The earlier Friends largely assumed suffering proves prior guilt. Elihu shifts the framework. For him, suffering may not always be straightforward punishment. It can also be instruction, correction, warning, divine communication. In other words, pain may serve pedagogical rather than merely punitive purposes. This is a subtle but significant development. Elihu suggests that God speaks in multiple ways: dreams, visions, affliction, circumstances, seeking to turn people away from destructive paths or deepen understanding. This makes his theology more sophisticated than the simple equation of suffering equals secret sin. He allows for a more complex moral universe. Yet he still fundamentally resists Job's protest. He believes Job has spoken too boldly, too self-defensively, too presumptuously regarding divine justice. Elihu strongly emphasizes divine transcendence. God is greater than humanity. Humans do not stand in a position to judge divine governance. This theme begins to anticipate what comes later when God himself speaks from the whirlwind. And this anticipation is one reason some interpreters view Elihu positively. He seems to prepare conceptual ground for the divine speeches, moving the conversation away from simplistic punishment formulas toward broader reflections on divine greatness and human limitation. But the debate is far from settled, because many readers find Elihu deeply frustrating. His speeches are long, repetitive in places, intensely self-confident. Some hear insight, others hear youthful arrogance wrapped in verbosity. And literary scholars have long noticed features that make Elihu's presence feel unusual. For one thing, he appears suddenly without prior mention. The narrative flow before his arrival does not clearly foreshadow him as a major participant. Second, at the book's conclusion, when God rebukes the three friends, Elihu is not explicitly mentioned. That silence has raised questions. If Elihu was correct, perhaps he escapes rebuke because his perspective was more faithful. If he was incorrect, why is he omitted? Third, some scholars note stylistic differences between Elihu's speeches and surrounding material, suggesting possible compositional layering. The theory of later insertion has therefore remained influential in some academic circles. According to this view, Elihu may represent an editorial attempt to bridge Job's protests and God's response, adding theological nuance after an earlier version of the book already existed. However, not all scholars agree. Many argue that Elihu's dramatic late arrival is intentional literary design rather than editorial accident. His youthful frustration, rhetorical overreach, and transitional theological role may be precisely what the author intended. From this perspective, Elihu enriches rather than disrupts the narrative, embodying a partially insightful but still incomplete human attempt to explain suffering. That ambiguity may actually be the point. Theologically, Elihu is fascinating because he occupies middle territory. He rejects some simplistic assumptions of the earlier friends, yet still cannot fully resolve Job's crisis. He offers more nuance, but not full resolution. This mirrors a broader human reality. More sophisticated explanations are not always sufficient explanations. Sometimes improved theology still fails to answer lived anguish. Psychologically, Elihu also represents a familiar archetype. The confident late entrant who believes previous voices lacked clarity. The observer who has listened long enough to become convinced he sees the solution. Sometimes such figures bring needed insight. Sometimes they underestimate the complexity they are entering. Elihu may be both at once. His emphasis on divine communication through suffering resonates with traditions that see pain as spiritually formative. Many later theological frameworks across different religious traditions have explored similar ideas. Suffering can humble, refine, redirect, expose illusion, deepen dependence. Yet, Job's case remains uniquely difficult because the audience knows something Elihu does not. Job's suffering is not explained in the simple instructional terms Elihu suggests. The heavenly prologue complicates every human theory presented in the debate. This is what makes the entire book so brilliant. Even the most sophisticated human explanations remain partial. Elihu may be wiser than the friends in some respects, but he is still speaking from limited perspective, and that limitation matters. One of the most interesting literary functions of Elihu is tension building. After exhausting the three friends' interpretive framework and Job's increasingly intense protest, the audience might expect direct divine intervention. Instead, another human voice appears. The delay increases anticipation. Will Elihu solve the mystery? Will he finally say what everyone else missed? The answer, ultimately, is no. He contributes, reframes, complicates, but does not resolve. That unresolved quality prepares the stage for the only voice left that could fundamentally shift the conversation: God himself. And perhaps that is Elihu's deepest narrative purpose, not to provide the final answer, but to demonstrate that even refined human theology still reaches limits. The debate has moved from simplistic accusation to more nuanced interpretation, but Job's central questions remain painfully alive. Why this suffering? Why this silence? Why this apparent injustice? Elihu speaks with conviction, but conviction is not the same as revelation. The human arguments have reached their outer boundary, and now, at last, after all the accusations, defenses, laments, theories, and speeches, the story approaches its most dramatic moment. Because the next voice that enters the conversation will not be another human being trying to explain God. It will be God responding directly. After everything, the losses, the disease, the silence, the accusations, the speeches, the philosophical warfare, the unanswered cries, the book of Job arrives at the moment readers have been waiting for with almost unbearable anticipation. God finally speaks. And yet what makes this moment so extraordinary is not merely that God responds, but how he responds. Because if most readers arrive here expecting a neat explanation, a direct answer to Job's suffering, or a divine courtroom verdict clarifying every hidden detail, the book of Job deliberately refuses those expectations. What comes instead is something stranger, larger, more unsettling, and arguably more profound. The Lord answers Job out of the whirlwind. That image matters immediately. Not a quiet whisper, not a gentle private conversation, not a calm theological seminar. A whirlwind, a storm. A manifestation of overwhelming force, mystery, motion, and power. In ancient biblical imagination, storm imagery often carries associations with divine majesty, transcendence, and terrifying presence. This is not casual conversation between equals. This is encounter with overwhelming reality. And the first words intensify the tension instantly. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? That opening has startled readers for centuries. After all Job has endured, after all the agony and unanswered pain, God does not begin with comfort. He begins with confrontation. But this confrontation must be understood carefully. The issue is not that Job's suffering was fake, nor that his grief was invalid. The issue concerns perspective. Job has spoken passionately about justice, suffering, innocence, and divine governance. Now, God challenges the limits of human understanding in relation to cosmic reality. Then comes one of the most remarkable rhetorical sequences in all sacred literature. God does not begin by explaining why Job suffered. Instead, he asks questions, relentless questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have you entered the storehouses of snow? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loose Orion's belt? The effect is overwhelming. This is not information delivery, it is cognitive destabilization. God is not offering abstract propositions. He is forcing Job to confront scale, creation, cosmology, weather, astronomy, animal life, natural processes, realities vast beyond human control. Some modern readers find this response frustrating. Job asked moral questions. Why suffering? Why apparent injustice? Why silence? God seems to answer with natural theology and cosmic grandeur. At first glance, it can feel evasive, but that reading may be too simple. The divine speeches are not random nature poetry. They systematically challenge assumptions about epistemic access, what human beings are actually in a position to know about governing reality. Job has asked morally serious questions, but underlying those questions is an implied assumption that he can adequately assess the total structure of justice. God's response interrogates that assumption directly. Can a finite creature perceive enough of reality to judge cosmic governance comprehensively? That is the deeper issue. The speeches move through astonishing domains: foundations of the earth, boundaries of the sea, dawn's ordering power, snow, hail, rain, lightning, constellations, mountain goats giving birth, wild donkeys roaming free, untamed oxen, hawks in flight, eagles dwelling in inaccessible heights. This catalog is not decorative filler. It portrays a world of extraordinary complexity, independence, wildness, and interconnected order far beyond human management. The universe is not a small moral machine designed for easy interpretation. It is vast, dynamic, layered, and filled with realities human beings neither control nor fully comprehend. This matters because the Friends assumed suffering could be read straightforwardly through visible moral equations. Job assumed his innocence should make the apparent injustice explicable. God's response destabilizes both simplifications. The universe is larger than either framework allows. There is also a fascinating emotional shift here. For chapters, Job has longed for encounter, demanding that God answer. Now the encounter arrives, and the sheer scale of divine presence transforms the emotional atmosphere. The issue is no longer merely argument. It becomes encounter with transcendence itself. That distinction matters. Sometimes, explanation and encounter are not identical needs. Human beings often think they want information, but sometimes the deeper longing is relational acknowledgement, to be seen, heard, addressed. Job receives no tidy explanation of the heavenly wager. He never learns about the accuser's challenge. Yet he does receive direct divine engagement. Theologically, this is enormously significant. Another major interpretive issue concerns tone. Is God rebuking Job harshly? Correcting him compassionately? Overwhelming him rhetorically? Demonstrating sovereignty? Inviting humility? Scholars and theologians differ. Some hear stern correction. Others hear majestic pedagogical redirection. Some emphasize divine transcendence. Others highlight that God actually shows up at all, suggesting profound relational seriousness. The text supports rich interpretive complexity. What seems clear is that God does not endorse the simplistic moral certainty of the Friends, nor does he validate every implication of Job's accusations. Instead, the divine speeches shift the entire frame. Justice is not denied, but neither is it reduced to immediate human interpretability. There is also a literary brilliance in what God does not say. He does not mention the heavenly council scene. He does not explain the wager. He does not tell Job, this was a test. This omission is extraordinary. Readers possess information Job never receives. Why? Perhaps because the book of Job is not trying to solve suffering through hidden procedural disclosure. If Job required backstage metaphysical explanations to find resolution, the message would be narrow. Instead, the narrative suggests that full explanatory transparency is not the normal human condition. Job must respond without possessing all the data, just as most sufferers do. Then comes the pause. After the first divine speech, Job responds briefly with humility, essentially acknowledging his smallness and placing his hand over his mouth. But God continues, which tells us the issue is deeper than merely silencing complaint. Something more remains to be addressed. The second speech intensifies themes of power, governance, justice, and eventually introduces the great, mysterious creatures that will dominate the next chapter. But even before those creatures appear, the essential shift has already occurred. The conversation is no longer about fitting suffering into simplistic formulas. It is about the staggering asymmetry between human perspective and cosmic governance. Modern readers often struggle with this because contemporary thought prizes explanation, transparency, and procedural fairness. Those instincts are understandable. Yet the Book of Job offers a more unsettling vision. Not that suffering is meaningless, but that meaning may exceed human interpretive capacity. Not that justice does not exist, but that justice cannot always be audited from finite experience. Not that questions are forbidden, but that some answers may transform the questioner rather than satisfy the question directly. And perhaps that is the real turning point here. God's response does not shrink reality down to Job's scale. It expands Job's awareness toward reality's scale. Whether comforting or disturbing, that expansion changes everything. Because after all the speeches, accusations, theories, and demands, the decisive event is not that Job finally receives explanation. It is that Job encounters the living God. And in that encounter, the argument enters an entirely new dimension. If the previous chapter brought Job face to face with the overwhelming scale of creation, this chapter takes the divine argument into even stranger territory. Because just when the audience might expect God to conclude his case with cosmic grandeur alone, the narrative suddenly zooms in on two extraordinary creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And for centuries, these beings have fascinated theologians, biblical scholars, historians, and ordinary readers alike. Are these literal animals, symbolic representations, mythic imagery adapted from ancient Near Eastern traditions, composite poetic figures, or something even more mysterious? Whatever answer one prefers, one thing is clear. These creatures are not random details. They sit at the dramatic climax of God's speeches for a reason. And understanding why matters enormously for understanding the book of Job itself. God first introduces Behemoth. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you. That phrase is important. Whatever Behemoth is, it belongs to creation, not divinity. It is something made, not a rival god. The description that follows is vivid and powerful. Behemoth eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in its loins. Power resides in the muscles of its belly. Its bones are like tubes of bronze, its limbs like bars of iron. It ranks among the first of the works of God. Rivers rage, yet it remains unshaken. Immediately, interpreters begin debating identity. Traditional proposals often include the hippopotamus. The grazing behavior fits, the immense strength fits, the river imagery fits reasonably well. Yet some details create tension. The famous line about its tail moving like a cedar has long complicated the hippopotamus interpretation, since hippopotamus tails are hardly cedar-like in ordinary visual terms. Some suggest poetic hyperbole rather than anatomical precision. Others propose elephant, though the river associations fit less naturally. Still, others argue that forcing strict zoological identification misses the literary function entirely. Then comes Leviathan, and the atmosphere becomes even more dramatic. If Behemoth is formidable, Leviathan is terrifying. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook? Can you tame it? Can you make it your servant? The answer is clearly no. The description becomes increasingly extraordinary. impenetrable scales, fearsome teeth, power that inspires dread, sneezing that flashes light, breath that seems to ignite flames, smoke from nostrils, a heart hard as stone, the sea churning behind it, kings trembling before it. At this point, literal zoological identification becomes far more difficult. Some interpreters historically proposed crocodile. Certain features align: armored body, aquatic setting, dangerous reputation, difficulty of capture. Yet fire-breathing imagery pushes many readers beyond ordinary animal classification. This is where ancient Near Eastern context becomes crucial. In the broader literary world surrounding ancient Israel, chaos monsters were common symbolic figures. Sea creatures representing disorder, untamable power, cosmic threat, or opposition to divine order appear in multiple traditions. Mesopotamian and Canaanite texts include combat myths involving divine victory over chaotic sea forces. Biblical literature itself occasionally uses similar imagery. Leviathan appears elsewhere as a formidable sea creature associated with chaos symbolism. Psalmic and prophetic texts invoke such imagery in ways not easily reduced to ordinary zoology. This has led many scholars to interpret Leviathan in Job not as a literal crocodile alone, but as theological chaos imagery reworked within biblical monotheism. But the interpretation is not simple. The Book of Job does not present Leviathan as an independent rival deity. Unlike pagan combat myths where gods battle cosmic equals, here Leviathan remains firmly within divine sovereignty. God describes it as part of creation. Fearsome, yes. Untamable by humans, certainly, but not beyond divine governance. This distinction matters enormously. The theological message is not dualistic cosmic struggle between equal powers. It is the assertion that even the most terrifying realities humans can imagine remain within the domain of the Creator. Some readers prefer literal interpretations. Young Earth creationist and some traditional literalist approaches may identify Behemoth and Leviathan as extinct megafauna, perhaps dinosaur-like creatures or unknown ancient animals. These readings often emphasize taking the descriptions at face value and resisting symbolic over-intellectualization. While such interpretations remain popular in certain communities, mainstream academic scholarship generally approaches the imagery through literary, comparative, and ancient contextual analysis, rather than modern cryptozoological reconstruction. Still, the persistence of literal readings reflects something important. These descriptions are meant to evoke awe. They are intentionally vivid, overwhelming, and resistant to easy domestication. Whether literal, symbolic, or hybrid, the emotional effect is the same. Humans encounter realities beyond their control, and that may be the deepest point. Because the Book of Job is not really asking modern taxonomy questions, it is asking theological ones. Why introduce these creatures at all? Why end the divine speeches not with abstract philosophy, but monstrous magnificence? One compelling interpretation is that Behemoth and Leviathan represent aspects of creation that appear dangerous, chaotic, untamable, even threatening, yet still belong within divine governance. Human beings naturally assume that order means predictability from our perspective. But creation contains wildness that exceeds human management. Job's suffering emerged partly from assumptions about moral predictability. Good people should be safe. Justice should be transparent. Reality should be legible. These creatures challenge that expectation dramatically. There are forces in existence that humans neither master nor fully understand. Yet their existence does not imply divine absence. Another interpretation sees the creatures as rhetorical escalation. God has already demonstrated Job's inability to govern ordinary creation. Morning, weather, stars, animal births, migration patterns. Now the argument intensifies. If Job cannot manage even these realities, how could he claim competence to audit cosmic justice? The creatures become symbols of epistemic humility, Still, another reading emphasizes existential fear. Leviathan in particular evokes the terror humans feel before overwhelming, uncontrollable threat. In that sense, the creature functions psychologically as much as zoologically. It embodies everything that makes existence feel dangerous: chaos, power, mortality, fear. And God's point may be that even what terrifies humanity most remains within larger divine reality. That is both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because chaos is not ultimate, unsettling because chaos is still permitted to exist. This ambiguity fits the entire book of Job remarkably well. It refuses simplistic emotional resolution, theologically. Behemoth and Leviathan may also serve as final dismantling of the Friends' worldview. Their theology imagined reality as a relatively tidy moral machine where outcomes were readable. But the divine speeches reveal a creation far stranger, wilder, and more complex than simplistic retribution formulas can accommodate. Job wanted answers about suffering. Instead, he receives a vision of reality whose scale and complexity destabilize narrow assumptions entirely. And perhaps that is why these creatures remain unforgettable. They resist reduction, literal animal, symbolic chaos, literary composite, theological metaphor. Perhaps the text intentionally preserves layered ambiguity because ambiguity itself is part of the lesson. Not everything in reality fits neat human categories. Not every danger is fully understandable. Not every question receives the kind of answer modern rationalism expects. But one truth emerges unmistakably. Whatever Behemoth and Leviathan represent, they do not represent realities outside God's awareness. And for Job, that changes the conversation profoundly. Because the man who once demanded explanation is now confronting a reality far larger, stranger, and more mysterious than he imagined. Which raises the final question. After all this, after suffering, protest, argument, divine encounter, and visions of uncontrollable creation, how does Job respond? After the whirlwind, after the relentless divine questioning, after the overwhelming visions of creation's scale and the terrifying majesty of Behemoth and Leviathan, the story arrives at a moment that should feel like resolution. Job finally responds. And yet this response has generated centuries of debate, precisely because it is far less simple than many readers assume. At first glance, the scene appears straightforward. Job humbles himself. He acknowledges divine greatness. He seems to repent. The narrative moves toward closure. But once we slow down and examine the language carefully, one difficult question emerges immediately. What exactly changed in Job? Did he admit he was wrong to question God? Did he retract claims of innocence? Did he repent of sinful arrogance? Or did something more complex happen? Something involving perspective, encounter, and transformed understanding rather than simple moral confession. These questions matter enormously because they shape how we understand the entire book of Job. Job's first brief response after the initial divine speech is strikingly restrained. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. This sounds like humility, perhaps even surrender. But importantly, this occurs before the second divine speech. It suggests Job recognizes the asymmetry between himself and the God now directly addressing him. Yet this is not necessarily a full theological reversal. It may simply be the natural response of a finite human confronted with overwhelming transcendence. Then comes the final response, the more famous and more contested one. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Already, Job acknowledges divine sovereignty at a profound level, but the interpretive difficulties intensify with what follows, especially in translation. Job references speaking of things he did not understand, things too wonderful for him. That seems clear enough. His prior assumptions about the comprehensibility of cosmic governance have been destabilized. But then comes the most debated line. Many English translations render it along the lines of, "Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." That sounds like straightforward repentance. Yet the Hebrew is more complex than many readers realize. The verb, often translated despise, lacks an explicit object in the original. Some scholars argue it may mean reject or retract rather than self-hatred. The phrase translated repent can also carry nuances involving relenting, changing one's mind, or being comforted. The exact force is debated. This matters enormously. If Job says he despises himself morally and repents of sinful rebellion, that suggests the divine speeches primarily functioned as correction of Job's improper attitude. But if the language instead means something closer to retracting his case, or yielding before mystery, or finding a changed posture in dust and ashes, then the meaning shifts significantly. Modern biblical scholarship reflects this debate intensely. Some interpreters emphasize traditional penitential reading. Job overstepped. He spoke beyond his knowledge. He now repents appropriately before divine majesty. This reading has long shaped many religious traditions because it aligns with themes of humility before God. Yet others push back strongly. They note that elsewhere in the book, Job's integrity is repeatedly affirmed. God later explicitly says the friends have not spoken rightly about him as Job has. That creates a major interpretive challenge. If Job's central error was wicked arrogance requiring moral repentance, why does God later commend him relative to the friends? This suggests the issue may be more nuanced. Some scholars propose that Job does not repent of questioning God, but of assuming he possessed sufficient perspective to demand explanatory adjudication. In this reading, Job's innocence regarding the accusations remains intact, but his understanding of reality has expanded. He does not confess hidden wickedness. He acknowledges epistemic limitation. Others suggest something even more relational. Job says, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." This may be the emotional center of the response. The transformation is not merely intellectual correction, it is encounter. Before, Job knew God through inherited understanding, theological categories, second-hand knowledge. Now, he has experienced direct encounter. And that encounter changes the terms of everything. If so, Job's response is less about moral humiliation and more about transformed relationship. Explanation was not fully granted, but presence was. This interpretation resonates with many readers because it fits the narrative structure. God never reveals the heavenly wager. He never tells Job why specific suffering occurred. If resolution depended on procedural explanation, the story fails. But if resolution involves encounter, perspective, and relational transformation, the story functions differently. Still, we should resist sentimental oversimplification. The book of Job does not end with easy emotional healing through vague spirituality. Job's children remain dead. His suffering was real. The unanswered specifics remain unanswered. Whatever transformation occurs is profound, but not simplistic. Another fascinating issue concerns whether Job's earlier questions were actually wrong. Remember, the friends insisted suffering proved hidden guilt. Job rejected that. And in the end, God rebukes the friends, not Job, for misrepresenting him. That strongly suggests Job's fundamental protest against false accusation was justified. The problem may not have been that Job questioned suffering, but that some of his language about divine governance exceeded what finite perspective could sustain. In other words, questioning itself is not condemned. Overclaiming interpretive certainty may be the deeper issue. Psychologically, Job's transformation also makes sense. Extreme suffering often produces relentless demand for explanation because uncertainty intensifies pain. But sometimes, what changes a sufferer is not complete explanation, but altered perspective, relationship, encounter, or recontextualization of the self within larger reality. This does not erase grief. It changes its framework. Job may still hurt, but he no longer occupies the same interpretive posture. There is also extraordinary literary sophistication here. The Book of Job refuses to flatten its protagonist into either perfect hero or arrogant sinner. Job is complex, honest, courageous, emotionally volatile, theologically profound, occasionally overreaching, deeply human. That complexity is precisely why the book remains powerful. It does not reward simplistic character categories. It preserves ambiguity, because human spiritual life is ambiguous. Some readers also notice something subtle but important. Job never receives the kind of answer modern audiences often expect. No direct explanation of the test, no rational breakdown of divine motives. And yet something in him changes enough for the narrative to move forward. That forces readers to confront a difficult possibility. Perhaps not every existential crisis is resolved through information. Perhaps some are transformed through encounter with realities larger than explanatory frameworks. That idea can feel either profound or frustrating, depending on one's expectations. Perhaps both. And maybe the Book of Job intends exactly that tension. What is clear is this. Job does not confess secret wickedness to satisfy the friend's accusations. That framework has failed. Nor does he continue pressing his lawsuit in the same manner. Something has shifted, whether we describe that as repentance, humility, epistemic surrender, relational transformation, or all of the above. The man who responds here is not the same man who cried out from ashes demanding explanation. The suffering has changed him. The encounter has changed him. The scale of reality has changed him. But one final challenge remains, because the story is not actually over. A conclusion still awaits. Restoration, vindication, a return to prosperity. And that ending, surprisingly, may raise some of the hardest questions of all. After the whirlwind, after divine confrontation, after philosophical collapse and transformed perspective, many readers expect a Book of Job to end quietly with reflective ambiguity. Instead, the narrative does something startling. It restores Job. His fortunes return. His wealth is multiplied. New children are born. Social standing is renewed. He lives long enough to see future generations. On the surface, this sounds like the kind of ending audiences naturally expect. Justice restored, suffering reversed, the righteous vindicated at last. But the more carefully we examine this conclusion, the more complicated and controversial it becomes. Because what initially appears comforting quickly raises some of the most difficult theological and emotional questions in the entire book. The closing movement begins not with Job's restoration, but with God's verdict regarding the friends. This matters. After all the speeches, the Lord tells Eliphaz, as representative of the friends, that his anger burns against them because they have not spoken rightly about him as Job has. That sentence is astonishing. Remember what the friends represented: moral certainty, retribution theology, confident explanations linking suffering directly to guilt. Their system seemed religious, orderly, morally intuitive. Yet God explicitly rejects it. This is one of the most decisive interpretive moments in the book. Whatever else readers debate, the simplistic equation of suffering with hidden wickedness has been formally condemned. That matters enormously for the theology of the entire narrative. Even more surprising, Job, the man accused throughout the debate, becomes the one asked to intercede for the friends. This reversal is powerful. The sufferer becomes mediator. The accused becomes spiritually authoritative.
The one treated as morally suspect becomes the instrument of reconciliation.
Symbolically, this is profound vindication. Job's integrity has not only survived scrutiny, it has been affirmed at the highest level. Yet even here, complexity remains. God says Job spoke rightly, but Job also clearly underwent transformation and correction regarding perspective. This reinforces the nuance explored in the previous chapter. Job was not flawless in every statement, but his honest wrestling was more faithful than the friend's false certainty. That distinction may be one of the book's deepest lessons. Then comes the restoration itself. The Lord restores Job's fortunes and gives him twice as much as before. Livestock numbers double. Social networks return. Brothers, sisters, acquaintances reappear, bringing gifts and renewed fellowship. Later, Job has 7 sons and 3 daughters, mirroring the original family structure. The daughters are named, unusually, and described in strikingly positive terms. Job lives another 140 years, sees multiple generations, and dies old and full of days. Structurally, the ending echoes prosperity narratives familiar in wisdom traditions. But emotionally, this is where modern readers often struggle, because a difficult question emerges immediately. Does restoration solve the problem? More bluntly, can new blessings erase old losses? New livestock can replace livestock. Wealth can be rebuilt. Social standing can return. But children are not interchangeable assets. 10 new children do not cancel the deaths of 10 previous children. No emotionally honest reading should pretend otherwise. This is one reason many contemporary readers find the ending deeply unsettling. If interpreted simplistically, the restoration risks sounding morally tone-deaf, as though catastrophic grief is neatly compensated by replacement abundance. But the text may be doing something more complex than crude arithmetic compensation. Ancient narrative conventions often use restoration imagery symbolically, communicating vindication, covenant blessing, and narrative closure rather than literal emotional equivalence. That distinction matters. The story may not be claiming Job forgot his dead children because new ones arrived. The emotional memory of loss is never explicitly erased. The restoration signals altered status, not necessarily psychological cancellation of grief. Still, the discomfort remains legitimate. The text does not fully narrate Job's emotional interior at this stage. We are not told how he processed remembered grief while living restored years. That silence leaves interpretive space. Some readers see theological hope. Others see unresolved tension. Perhaps both responses are appropriate. Another major interpretive controversy concerns the relationship between the ending and the book's critique of retribution theology. At first glance, restoring Job with doubled prosperity seems to reinforce exactly the worldview the friends defended. Good people are blessed after all. So did the book ultimately circle back to the same framework it spent chapters destabilizing? This is a serious question. Several responses have been proposed. One view argues the restoration is narrative epilogue, not theological formula. It provides closure without re-endorsing simplistic causation. Job's suffering was not punishment, and his restoration is not payment in a transactional sense. Another interpretation sees restoration as symbolic grace rather than earned reward. Job does not manipulate God into blessing through perfect behavior. The restoration reflects divine freedom, not mechanistic moral economics. Others remain uneasy, arguing the ending partially reabsorbs the book's radical critique into more traditional wisdom expectations. That tension has fueled scholarly debate for generations. There is also the question of genre. If Job functions partly as wisdom drama rather than modern psychological realism, The ending may operate differently than contemporary narrative expectations assume. Ancient audiences often accepted stylized closure, serving theological communication rather than exhaustive emotional realism. Yet modern readers naturally bring different sensitivities, especially regarding trauma, grief, and relational loss. Those sensitivities reveal real interpretive tensions rather than mere misunderstanding. One subtle but beautiful feature often overlooked is the treatment of Job's daughters. They are named Jemima, Keziah, and Keren Happuch. Unlike the sons, they are described as exceptionally beautiful, and Job grants them inheritance alongside their brothers, a striking detail within ancient patriarchal context. Some scholars see this as symbolic restoration, not merely of wealth, but of social generosity, dignity, and transformed familial legacy. Whether that symbolism is intentional or not, the narrative detail is notable. Psychologically, the ending remains profoundly complex. Trauma does not disappear because circumstances improve. Grief does not obey narrative symmetry. A person who loses children and later experiences blessing remains a person who lost children. The Book of Job does not explicitly explore long-term trauma psychology in modern terms, but emotionally aware readers rightly feel the tension. The restored ending is hopeful, but not emotionally simple. Theologically, perhaps the most important thing the ending does is refuse nihilism. Suffering is real, but not ultimate. Silence is terrifying, but not permanent. False accusations fail. Divine encounter changes perspective. Restoration, however interpreted, becomes a statement that catastrophe does not have final narrative authority. Yet the book simultaneously refuses cheap formulas. Job was not restored because the friend's logic was correct. He was not suffering because he secretly deserved it. That distinction remains decisive. The ending also raises a subtle question about divine generosity. Is restoration justice, mercy, gift, narrative symbol, some combination? The text does not reduce it to one category, perhaps intentionally, and maybe that ambiguity preserves the complexity the whole book has insisted upon. Not every blessing is simplistic reward. Not every suffering is punishment. Not every resolution explains everything. Which brings us to the emotional truth of the ending. The Book of Job concludes with restoration, but not with complete explanatory transparency. Readers still wrestle. Some feel comforted. Some feel troubled. Some both. That may be exactly the point, because the story has never offered tidy religious formulas. It has dismantled them repeatedly. And now, with the narrative ending in blessing but leaving interpretive tension intact, the final question becomes unavoidable. After everything Job endured, what does this story ultimately mean for us? What is the real lesson of Job? After 14 chapters of devastation, silence, argument, mystery, divine encounter, and uneasy restoration, we arrive at the final and perhaps most important question. What does the story of Job actually mean? Because if we reduce this book to a simple moral slogan, we will completely miss its power. The Book of Job is not a children's lesson about staying positive during hard times. It is not a simplistic prosperity narrative disguised as suffering. It is not proof that every painful event has an easily discoverable hidden reason. In fact, one of the most extraordinary things about Job is how aggressively it resists simplistic conclusions. It is one of the most intellectually demanding and emotionally honest texts in all of Scripture, precisely because it refuses to protect us from difficult truths. The first, and perhaps most obvious lesson, is also one of the most uncomfortable. Suffering is not always punishment. That may sound simple, but within the world of Job, and honestly within many religious cultures even now, this is a revolutionary claim. Job's friends represented a worldview many people instinctively understand. Good behavior should lead to blessing. Catastrophe must imply moral failure. If someone suffers severely, perhaps hidden guilt explains it. This framework offers emotional security because it makes the world predictable. Behave well, and disaster stays away. But the Book of Job destroys that illusion. Job is introduced as righteous. His suffering is not presented as punishment for secret corruption. That matters enormously, because one of the cruelest things humans often do is turn suffering people into moral puzzles, assuming pain must reveal guilt. Job says no. The second lesson is equally unsettling. Human beings do not always receive explanations. Modern readers often expect narratives to reward endurance with clarity. But Job never learns about the heavenly challenge. He never receives backstage access to the cosmic conversation readers were shown. This literary decision is astonishingly important. If the point of the book were that suffering becomes acceptable once fully explained, Job should have received the explanation. He does not, which means the story is confronting a painful reality. Human suffering often unfolds without transparent answers. We ask why. And heaven does not always provide procedural detail. That does not mean suffering is meaningless. It means meaning is not always delivered in the form we demand. Third, the Book of Job legitimizes lament. This may be one of its most pastorally important contributions. Job cries out, he protests, he questions. He expresses anguish so raw that many religious communities would feel uncomfortable hearing it spoken aloud. Yet Scripture preserves those words, not as embarrassing mistakes to be deleted, but as part of sacred discourse. That matters. It means emotional honesty is not automatically spiritual failure. Despair is not identical to unbelief. Questioning is not necessarily rebellion. Faith can sound like praise, yes, but sometimes faith sounds like wounded protest refusing to stop addressing God. That distinction changes everything for people who suffer honestly. The fourth lesson concerns theological certainty. Job's friends were not obviously wicked men. They were morally serious, religiously motivated, intellectually coherent, and they were profoundly wrong. This is one of the book's sharpest warnings. Bad theology often arrives wearing the clothes of certainty and piety. Confidence does not equal truth. Religious explanations can become instruments of cruelty when they prioritize system preservation over compassion. The friends wanted suffering to make sense, but enforcing false explanations, they wounded the sufferer further. That warning remains disturbingly relevant. Fifth, the Book of Job radically humbles human claims to comprehensive understanding. God's speeches do not deny justice, but they challenge human assumptions about our ability to audit cosmic governance from limited perspective. This is not anti-intellectualism. Job is a profoundly intellectual book. It asks serious questions, but it does insist on epistemic humility. There are dimensions of reality, causation, complexity, and meaning beyond human mastery. Modern people, despite scientific advancement, still confront this truth. We know more than ancient civilizations about many mechanisms, but existential mystery remains. Why this suffering? Why now? Why them? Why not others? Some questions remain resistant to full human explanation. Sixth, the Book of Job challenges transactional religion. Remember the accuser's central question. Does Job fear God for nothing? Is devotion merely self-interested exchange, blessing in return for loyalty? The entire narrative tests this possibility. Can faith survive when reward disappears? This question remains piercingly relevant. Much religious practice can subtly become transactional, pray for outcomes, obey for protection, worship for blessing. Job exposes how fragile such frameworks become when suffering arrives. If faith depends entirely on favorable circumstances, what happens when life collapses? Seventh,
encounter matters as much as explanation. Job's transformation does not come through receiving a neat procedural answer. It comes through encounter with divine reality. This is one of the book's strangest and most debated lessons. It does not mean explanation is unimportant. Humans naturally seek understanding. But Job suggests that relational encounter can transform suffering in ways information alone cannot. Not because pain becomes trivial, but because perspective changes. This remains a difficult idea, especially for modern rational sensibilities. Yet it sits at the heart of the narrative. Eighth, the world is stranger than simplistic moral systems allow. Behemoth, Leviathan, wild creation, untamable forces. The book of Job presents reality as vast, layered, dangerous, beautiful, and not fully domesticated by human categories. This matters because simplistic religion often imagines reality as a small machine of predictable reward and punishment. Job presents something larger. Creation includes wildness, complexity, ambiguity. That does not mean chaos is ultimate, but it does mean reality is not easily reduced. Ninth, restoration does not erase suffering. The ending offers hope, but not amnesia. New blessings do not cancel old grief. This matters pastorally and emotionally. Too many interpretations treat restoration as emotional arithmetic, but trauma does not work that way. The book of Job's ending should not be weaponized into telling sufferers that future blessings make past losses irrelevant. That would repeat the friend's lack of compassion in a different form. Hope and grief can coexist. 10th, perhaps the deepest lesson is this: faithfulness is not the absence of struggle. Many people imagine faith as emotional certainty, stable composure, or uninterrupted confidence. Job destroys that stereotype. Faithfulness in this book includes worship, lament, protest, confusion, humility, persistence, and unresolved tension. It is messy, human, honest. That may be one reason the story endures so powerfully across centuries. It tells the truth about suffering without surrendering to nihilism. So what does Job mean for modern audiences? It means the person suffering illness is not automatically under judgment. It means unanswered prayer is not proof of abandonment. It means grief does not make you spiritually defective. It means simplistic explanations may harm more than heal. It means mystery is not the same as meaninglessness. It means honest questions belong in sacred conversation. It means humility matters. It means faith may sometimes look less like certainty and more like refusal to walk away from the conversation entirely. Ultimately, the book of Job does not solve suffering the way a philosophical formula solves an equation. It does something harder and perhaps more truthful. It invites us into the tension of being human before a reality larger than ourselves. It validates anguish without glorifying despair. It challenges certainty without glorifying chaos. It preserves mystery without declaring existence absurd. And maybe that is why, thousands of years later, Job still feels terrifyingly alive. Because sooner or later, almost everyone becomes Job in some way. Not in identical circumstances, but in the deeper existential sense. A moment comes when life no longer fits the moral equations we trusted, when suffering arrives without explanation, when silence feels unbearable, when easy answers fail. And in that moment, the ancient story still whispers something profoundly important. You are not the first to ask these questions. The questions themselves belong in the story.